I'm not looking for a deal. I mean, we've set the deal. It's at 50%.
Of the lowest levels on record amid a fierce trade war. Yesterday, President Trump said he's ready to make a deal.
We strongly regret the announced increase of steel tariffs from 25% to 50% by the US. We believe that this decision adds further uncertainty to the global economy.
A $43 billion Boeing deal just collapsed without warning. The European Union has officially paused its massive order of US-made aircraft in direct retaliation to Trump's new 50% tariff on EU automotive and industrial imports. Brussels isn't bluffing. Behind closed doors, European leaders are drawing a red line. If Washington weaponizes trade, Europe will walk away. And now, analysts warn that the fallout could cost up to $2 trillion in transatlantic commerce over the next decade. This isn't just a trade dispute. It's the unraveling of one of the deepest economic ties in modern history. Boeing is left scrambling, Airbus shares surged, and Washington silent. The question no one in D.C. wants to answer: did America just push its closest ally into economic divorce? The financial impact was instant. Within just 48 hours of Trump's June 1st tariff hike and aggressive 50% duty on European industrial imports, the European stock market sank by 2.1%, erasing over $150 billion in market value across sectors. Aerospace, autos, and banking led the downturn, but the real panic hit across the Atlantic. In the U.S., Boeing, already reeling from delivery delays and rising production costs, saw its stock plunge further, dragging the entire aerospace sector down 6.2% year-to-date. But Wall Street jitters are just the surface. The real crisis is confidence. Executives in Brussels and Frankfurt are now questioning whether American suppliers can be relied on when Washington flips its trade policy overnight. According to sources from the Financial Times and Reuters, Ryanair is now actively reconsidering its $30 billion 737 MAX deal, one of Boeing's largest active contracts in Europe. Even more concerning, COMAC, China's state-backed rival to Boeing and Airbus, has quietly entered talks with European buyers who are seeking less politically volatile partners. What once felt unthinkable is now gaining traction, a European pivot away from Boeing altogether. And the numbers don't lie. If even a fraction of Boeing's international clients shift to COMAC or Airbus, it could signal a structural collapse in U.S. aviation dominance. For now, there's no official cancellation. But for investors and insiders, the writing is already on the wall. When geopolitics infect supply chains, business decisions stop being about quality or price. They become about survival. Brussels didn't blink. Within days of Trump's 50% tariff announcement, the European Union unveiled a $95 billion, $107 billion retaliation pact, precision-engineered to hurt American exports, where it stings most commercial aircraft, automobiles, wine, whiskey, and industrial machinery. This wasn't a random list. It was a targeted response designed to hit U.S. strongholds in both red and blue states while sending a unified signal Europe won't be bullied at the negotiating table. At the same time, the EU filed formal complaints with the World Trade Organization, arguing that the U.S. had violated basic trade norms by escalating without consultation. Washington called it defensive, but in Brussels, it was framed as long overdue symmetry. But the retaliation didn't stop at tariffs. It came with a pivot. While U.S. exports face steeper barriers, Europe is quietly strengthening trade corridors elsewhere, most notably with Canada. Under the CETA agreement, EU-Canada trade has surged by over 70% since 2022, and it's now projected to hit $90 billion annually by 2026, according to European News and the Information and Communications Technology Council of Canada. From pharmaceuticals to precision tech, the new corridor is absorbing the trade flow that once passed through U.S. ports. Canadian producers are stepping in where American suppliers once dominated, filling EU contracts for agricultural goods, clean tech, and even aerospace parts. For European importers, Canada now offers stability alignment with EU climate and labor standards, and most importantly, no surprise tariffs. In other words, what Washington just lost Ottawa is quietly gaining. This isn't just economic chess, it's a long game.
I will say that 80% of the airplanes we deliver, the commercial airplanes we deliver, are outside of the United States. So free trade is very important to us. And 80% of the content of those airplanes, it comes out of the United States.
And the U.S., once the boardmaster, is watching allies redraw the map without waiting for a green light from D.C. While Washington doubled down on tariffs and trade walls, Brussels rewrote the rulebook, and did it fast. Instead of chasing short-term retaliation, the European Union pivoted toward long-term resilience, using the US shock as a catalyst. In the weeks following the tariff war's escalation, EU trade officials moved swiftly to expand the Canada corridor, doubling down on the CETA framework as a blueprint for a new class of modernized trade compacts. Deals are now in motion across Africa, India, and the UAE, all loosely modeled on CETA, focusing on low tariffs, regulatory alignment, and mutual infrastructure investment rather than the tit-for-tat brinkmanship seen in Washington. But the shift wasn't just diplomatic, it was financial. EU foreign investment into Canada's clean tech sector jumped 41% year-over-year, according to Bloomberg, with over $1.2 billion channeled directly into hydrogen production and green energy systems in provinces like Alberta and Quebec. These are projects that just 2 years ago would have likely involved US partners. Now Washington is shut out entirely, not because it lost its capabilities, but because it lost predictability. In the eyes of Brussels, trade isn't just about access anymore. It's about stability, climate ambition, and political coherence. As a result, the EU isn't just reacting, it's future-proofing. It's building parallel supply chains, climate-linked investment corridors, and long-term energy alliances all outside US reach.
I need you guys to understand that even if this guy does his deal-making thing, the disruptions are already locked in. This is the trucking volume coming out of Los Angeles. Here's the annual graph, and this is this year so far. Notice how right now the volume is about similar to Thanksgiving and Christmas?
And the message is clear. If the United States wants to retreat behind economic walls, Europe will redraw the map without it. It's no longer just a policy disagreement. What we're witnessing is the slow collapse of a decades-old economic framework, the Western trade consensus that once unified the US, Canada, and Europe under a common vision of free trade, shared growth, and predictable cooperation. And at the heart of this unraveling, a quiet, underestimated agreement called CETA. For years, the Comprehensive Economic and Trade Agreement between the EU and Canada was treated as a side project, too technical, too narrow, rarely discussed outside of trade ministries. But in 2025, it became something else entirely, a strategic lifeline. As Washington weaponized tariffs and froze out even its closest allies, Brussels turned to Ottawa not out of preference but necessity. And in doing so, Europe began shifting its entire trade infrastructure, its contracts, its capital, its trust away from the United States and into Canadian hands. That shift is measurable. Under CETA, EU-Canada trade has surged by more than 70% since 2022. Canadian ports are expanding. Its customs systems are being modernized to handle EU regulatory standards, and joint investments in climate-linked infrastructure are accelerating, especially in clean tech, agriculture, and digital supply chains. Regulatory alignment is deepening with Canada, increasingly adopting EU-style rules on labor product safety and environmental protection. What was once a nice-to-have deal has become a core pillar of Europe's post-American trade strategy. Meanwhile, the US is facing the consequences of its own choices. The Trump administration's trade war was sold to the public as an act of protection, one that would restore American manufacturing/deficits and make domestic industry more competitive. But the data paints a different picture. According to the Tax Foundation and PowerShift, the U.S. trade deficit reached a record-breaking $140.5 billion in early 2025, the largest quarterly gap ever recorded. That's not resilience, that's exposure. The promised reshoring of industry hasn't materialized. Instead, businesses are paying more for imported parts, facing higher production costs, and losing access to foreign markets that are now turning to Canada, Mexico, and the EU. Worse still, these shifts aren't temporary, they're structural. Once supply chains move, they rarely come back. And as Europe pours billions into new frameworks that deliberately exclude U.S. infrastructure and regulatory unpredictability, Washington's influence over global trade is shrinking in real time. The symbolism is hard to ignore. A continent that once relied on American leadership to defend liberal trade is now building parallel systems to insulate itself from U.S. policy swing. Canada, once seen as a junior partner in North American trade, is now emerging as a geostrategic bridge between Europe and Asia, trusted, stable, and increasingly central. And the U.S., it's being edged out of the system it helped create. This isn't just about tariffs, it's about something much bigger, the end of U.S. monopoly over Western trade governance. A world where Washington no longer sets the rules, but watches others write them. And as Europe pivots, Canada expands and global supply chains reroute. One question is becoming unavoidable. Can the United States still lead if no one is following? The shift isn't just economic, it's geopolitical, and it's accelerating. As Europe's confidence in U.S. leadership continues to erode, we're seeing a quiet but decisive realignment of power. Routes trade corridors and political influence away from Washington and toward Ottawa. This isn't symbolic, it's strategic, and the data proves it. Since 2016, EU-Canada trade has surged by 71%, growing from $72 billion to over $123 billion, according to EU News and PowerShift. That's not just the result of tariff avoidance. It's a conscious decision to route commerce through a partner perceived as stable, rules-based, and immune to the volatility coming from DC. CETA has become more than a trade pact. It's now a geopolitical corridor, one that connects European investment and policy to North American resources without relying on U.S. cooperation. And while trade routes expand through Canada, withdrawals from U.S.-centered frameworks are accelerating across industries. Boeing, once the crown jewel of transatlantic aerospace, is now losing ground fast. Not just because of delays or quality concerns, but because European buyers no longer trust the political backdrop behind American manufacturing. According to insider reports, multiple EU buyers, including Ryanair, are exploring alternatives in Asia, particularly China's COMAC, which is aggressively courting international clients disillusioned by U.S. trade unpredictability. But the pivot goes beyond planes. In digital infrastructure data, protection, clean tech investment, and AI regulation, European policymakers are actively bypassing Washington. Recent EU-funded initiatives in cloud computing, 5G, and hydrogen energy have partnered with Canadian and Japanese firms, not American ones, even when U.S. providers offered better prices or scale. This reorientation is reshaping global diplomacy. For decades, the U.S. could assume that allies would always look first to Washington for leadership, financing, and innovation. Now the calculus is shifting. Europe sees Ottawa, Tokyo, and even New Delhi as more reliable long-term partners for building the next-generation economy, green, digital, and globally integrated. And what was once unthinkable is becoming normalized a West, where Washington is no longer the default anchor. So the question isn't whether America still matters. Of course it does. The real question is, does the rest of the world still want to build around it? Let's be clear, this isn't a typical trade war. There's no shouting match at the WTO, no dramatic speeches, no headlines with tariffs being walked back. This is something deeper, more deliberate, a managed exit. In less than a year, the European Union began systematically shedding its economic dependence on the United States. Not with confrontation, but with substitution. New trade corridors opened, old assumptions were retired, and behind the scenes, supply chains built over decades were rerouted in months without Washington's approval. At the center of this shift, Canada. A country long seen as a junior partner in the North American alliance has now become the new hub for Western trade resilience. With stable institutions, aligned climate policies, and a deepening relationship with Brussels, Canada replaced, not rivaled, the U.S. in key industries. And while America focused on building tariff walls, the rest of the West quietly built a new map, one that no longer requires Washington's signature. Trump's 50% tariffs didn't just isolate the U.S. from its competitors. They isolated it from its allies. While D.C. celebrated economic sovereignty, Brussels rewrote the rules, redirecting trade through Canada, launching new global blocs and replacing trust with alternatives. Europe didn't just retaliate, it evolved. And now the transatlantic alliance isn't collapsing, it's being rebuilt. Without America at the center. Subscribe to stay ahead of the next shift. Comment below, is Canada becoming the new Western anchor or just a temporary bridge? Share this video if you believe trade wars don't just destroy markets, they redraw the map of influence.